The Duke thought he erased her, until destiny revealed she was mother to his only heir. Westshire estate borders, autumn 1848. Leaves fell across the cottage garden like copper coins no one bothered to claim. Karen T. Mash hung laundry with hands that had learned not to tremble. Hands that had scrubbed floors in the Duke's house. Hands that had touched his face in darkness before the world decided she was disposable. The wind carried the scent of burning wood from distant chimneys, estate chimneys, chimneys that belonged to a life she had been expelled from like poison from a wound. Thomas played at her feet, 5 years old, dark curls catching autumn light. He built towers from stones, knocked them down, rebuilt them with the concentrated determination of a child who believed the world could be ordered by will alone. She watched him the way mothers watch miracles they are terrified to lose. He had her stubborn mouth, her quick temper, her capacity for joy despite everything. But his eyes, those eyes were not hers. Grey-blue, sharp as winter sky, the kind of eyes that belonged to portraits in grand halls, to men who commanded counties, to the Duke of Westshire. She had taught the boy never to ask, never to wonder why they lived in a stone cottage at the edge of nowhere, never to question why she flinched when carriages passed on the distant road, never to reach for a world designed to crush people like them. 5 years. 5 years of deliberate invisibility. 5 years of mending clothes for villagers who whispered disgraced when they thought she couldn't hear. 5 years of building a life from the ruins of the one stolen from her. She had convinced herself they were safe. Then the black carriage appeared at the gate. It moved slowly, wheels crunching over gravel, pulled by horses too fine for this forgotten corner of Westshire. The crest blazed gold against lacquered black, a falcon, wings spread, talons extended. She knew that crest. She had dusted it from mantles, polished it from silver, seen it stamped on the letters that dismissed her without mercy. Thomas looked up. "Mama," her hands stilled on the laundry. "Go inside." "But now, Thomas." The boy obeyed, confused, clutching his stones as he disappeared through the cottage door. Karen stood alone in the garden, laundry forgotten, as the carriage door opened. James C. Miller stepped down onto her property as if he still owned it. Perhaps he did. Dukes owned everything, even the people they destroyed. He wore black, expensively tailored, his face harder than she remembered, lines carved by years she had not witnessed. But the eyes were the same eyes she saw every morning in her son's face. He did not smile, did not soften. He stood at her gate like a man attending an execution he had scheduled himself. When he spoke, his voice was exactly as she remembered, controlled, aristocratic, cold enough to freeze oceans. "Miss Mash, we must speak." Karen did not invite him inside. She stood in the garden, autumn wind pulling at her skirts, and forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. 5 years ago she would have curtsied. 5 years ago she would have lowered her eyes and called him Your Grace and waited for permission to exist in his presence. 5 years had burned that deference to ash. "There is nothing to speak about," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced this, imagined this confrontation 1,000 times in the dark. "You made yourself clear." "Karen." "Miss Mash." The correction came sharp as a slap. "You lost the right to my Christian name when you had me thrown from your house like refuse." Something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or merely discomfort at being reminded of unpleasantness. Men like him were skilled at forgetting the people they discarded. "I did not come to argue," he said. "I came because—" He paused, and for the first time she saw what 5 years had done to him. The Duke of Westshire looked haunted. "Because I must know the truth. The truth." She laughed, bitter as burnt bread. "You want truth now? Where was truth when your advisers accused me of theft? Where was truth when they called me a liar and a whore in front of the entire staff? Where was truth when I begged you, James, to speak for me, and you stood silent as stone? I was—" He stopped, drew breath like a man drowning. "I was a coward." The admission should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like reopening a wound that had barely scarred over. "Yes," she said quietly. "You were." He looked past her, toward the cottage, and she knew what he was searching for. The knowledge that had driven him here, across his own lands, to the forgotten edge of his estate where disgraced servants went to disappear. "Is it true?" His voice dropped to something almost raw. "The boy, is he mine?" Karen's hands curled into fists. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to deny, to protect Thomas from this man who had already proven what he would sacrifice for reputation and inheritance. But Thomas was inside. Thomas, who asked questions about horses and grand houses. Thomas, who dreamed of places he had never seen but somehow remembered. Thomas, who deserved more than a mother's protective lies. "Why?" she asked instead. "Why now, after 5 years of silence? What changed?" The Duke's jaw tightened. "My valet, William. He died 3 weeks ago." "I remember William." The old man had been kind to her once, had looked away when she and James met in corridors where they should not have been. He made a deathbed confession. James spoke as if each word cost him. "He told me you were with child when you left. He told me—" His voice cracked, actually cracked. "He told me the boy has my eyes." Silence fell between them like a curtain. In the cottage, Thomas laughed at something, the sound pure and unknowing. "God, forgive us all," James whispered. "William said that. God forgive us all." And I understood, finally, what we had done, what I had done. Karen felt something dangerous unfold in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition, perhaps, that the man before her was no longer the frightened nobleman who had chosen his title over her. This man looked like someone who had spent 5 years learning to hate himself. "Why are you here?" she asked again. "What do you want from us?" "I need an heir." The words came blunt, unadorned. "My line is dying. My cousin Pemberton circles like a vulture, spreading poison, positioning himself to claim Westshire. If I die without acknowledged issue, everything passes to him. A man who will bleed these lands dry and brutalize anyone too weak to resist." "And so you remembered the servant girl you ruined?" Karen's voice turned to ice. "How convenient. How desperately convenient. That's not—" He stopped himself. "You have every right to believe the worst of me. I have earned nothing else, but I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking—" He met her eyes, and she saw something she had never expected to see in a duke's face. True fear. "I am asking for a chance to know my son." "Your son." She tasted the words like poison. 5 years, James. 5 years Thomas has lived without a father because you were too much of a coward to claim him. And now, because you need something, because your precious dukedom requires an heir, you arrive with your carriages and your demands and expect— What? That I'll simply hand him over? No. His voice dropped. I expect nothing. I'm asking. There is a difference. Karen stared at the man who had destroyed her life and given her the one thing worth living for. She thought of Thomas inside, innocent, building his stone towers, dreaming his impossible dreams. She thought of the years ahead, the questions that would come, the hunger for a father that no amount of maternal love could fill. She thought of the Duke's cousin, the rumors she had heard even in her isolation. Lord Pemberton, cruel and corrupt, the kind of man who would inherit a dukedom and use it as a weapon. One afternoon, she said finally, supervised, here, where Thomas feels safe, you will not tell him who you are, you will not make promises you cannot keep, and if he is frightened, if he is uncomfortable for even a moment, you will leave and never return. James nodded slowly. Thank you. Do not thank me. Karen's voice could have cut glass. I am not doing this for you. I am doing this because my son deserves better than a mother's bitterness and a father's cowardice. But understand this, if you hurt him, if you abandon him the way you abandoned me, I will make certain you regret it for whatever remains of your miserable life. The Duke of Westshire, one of the most powerful men in England, looked at the woman he had wronged and said quietly, I believe you. He returned to his carriage. Before, climbing inside, he turned back. Karen, Miss Mash, for what it is worth, which I know is nothing, I am sorry. Sorrier than you will ever know. She did not respond. She stood in her garden and watched the black carriage roll away, back toward the estate, back toward the world of power and privilege that had nearly destroyed her. Inside, Thomas waited, still playing with his stones. And Karen T. Mash, who had survived erasure and rebuilt herself from nothing, realized that the past was not finished with her after all. Some ghosts, it seemed, learned to knock. He returned 3 days later, alone, on horseback instead of by carriage. Karen watched him approach from the cottage window, her heart a clenched fist in her chest. Thomas sat at the table behind her, practicing letters she had taught him, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Someone is coming, the boy announced, abandoning his slate to press his face against the glass beside hers. Is that a duke's horse, Mama? She had never told him what dukes looked like, what they rode, what they owned. But children knew things, absorbed them from air and silence and the shape of their mother's fear. Just a visitor, she said, smoothing her apron with hands that wanted to shake. Remember your manners. James dismounted with the practiced grace of a man born to riding, to command, to spaces where people made room without being asked. But when Karen opened the door, she saw something she had not expected: uncertainty. The Duke of Westshire stood on her threshold looking like a man who had forgotten how to enter rooms. Miss Mash, he said formally, then quieter, thank you. She did not invite him to sit. She stood between him and Thomas like a shield made of flesh and fierce maternal will, and waited. James's gaze moved past her, found the boy at the table and stopped. Simply stopped. Karen watched the Duke's face crack open, watched 5 years of deliberate ignorance shatter against the reality of his son. Thomas looked up, curious, unafraid, and met his father's eyes with eyes that were identical, grey-blue, sharp, questioning. Who are you? Thomas asked, direct as only children dare to be. James opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I'm a friend of your mother's. My name is James. Do you live in the big house? Thomas pointed vaguely toward the distant estate. The one with all the chimneys. I do. I knew it. Thomas beamed with the satisfaction of a mystery solved. You have a duke's horse. I could tell. Karen watched James struggle with the weight of that innocence, that easy acceptance. The boy had no idea he was speaking to the man who had erased his mother from polite society, who had chosen reputation over love, who had abandoned him before birth. "Would you like to walk with me?" James asked, voice careful as a man approaching a wild animal. "Perhaps see the horse?" Thomas looked to Karen. She had taught him that always look to Mama first. She nodded, barely, and the boy launched himself from his chair with the boundless energy of the young and unburdened. They walked the garden together, Thomas chattering about stones and birds and the fox he had seen last week. James listened with an intensity that bordered on religious, as if every word was scripture he had been forbidden to hear. Karen followed 3 paces behind, close enough to intervene, far enough to let them exist in the same space. She watched James crouch to Thomas's height to examine a particularly interesting beetle. Watched him show Thomas how to let the creature crawl across his palm without fear. Watched her son laugh, delighted, and saw the exact same laugh ghost across the Duke's face, an expression of pure, unguarded joy she had not witnessed in 6 years. "He has your stubbornness," James said quietly, when Thomas ran ahead to investigate something in the grass. "Your strength." "He has your arrogance," Karen replied. "Your certainty that the world will bend to accommodate him." "Is that what you think of me?" "I think you are a man who had everything and chose to keep it rather than fight for anything that mattered." The words came cold, precise, surgical. "I think you stood silent while your advisors destroyed me because speaking would have cost you something precious. Your spotless reputation, your easy inheritance, your place in a world that demands perfection from its nobility." James did not look at her. He watched Thomas chase a butterfly, small hands grasping at air and possibility. "They told me you had stolen from the household," he said. "Planted silver in your quarters where the housekeeper would find it. They said if I defended you, if I showed any favor, the scandal would ruin everything my father had built. They said—" His voice broke. "They said you were not worth the cost. And you believed them." I was 24 years old and terrified of losing everything I had been raised to protect. He turned to face her finally, and she saw tears he refused to let fall. "So, yes. I believed what I needed to believe. I signed the papers that dismissed you. I watched you leave. And I told myself it was necessary, that it was duty, that it was the price of being Duke." He paused. "I have spent 5 years learning I was wrong about everything that matters." Thomas returned, breathless, holding a crushed flower like a trophy. "Look. For you, Mama." She took it, precious as gold, and tucked it behind her ear. The boy grinned, proud, then looked to James expectantly, waiting for approval from this man he had known for less than an hour. James smiled, genuine and broken, and Karen saw the truth she had been fighting. This man loved their son, already, completely, with the desperate intensity of someone who had just discovered what he had lost. The afternoon ended too quickly and not quickly enough. James mounted his horse, lingered in the saddle, looked back at the woman and child who were rebuilding his understanding of what mattered. "What would it take?" he asked. Not to the heir, not to God, but directly to Karen. "What would it take for you to trust me again?" She held Thomas's hand, felt her son's small fingers wrapped around hers, and knew there was no answer that would satisfy either of them. "I don't know if I can," she said honestly. "Trust is not a door you can simply knock on after 5 years of silence." James nodded slowly, accepting the wound. "Then I will have to earn it." He rode away across autumn fields, and Karen stood in her garden holding their son's hand, wondering if redemption was something a duke could afford, or if it would cost him everything he had left to lose. The rumours reached Westshire like plague carried on expensive stationery. Lord Pemberton had begun his campaign with surgical precision. Whispers in London, drawing rooms, carefully placed doubts at White's, sympathetic observations about the Duke's extended bachelorhood and curious lack of legitimate issue. By the time the gossip arrived at the estate itself, it had calcified into something far more dangerous than mere speculation. James sat in his study, while his senior adviser, Lord Ashford, paced before the fireplace like a general surveying battlefield losses. 3 other advisers occupied chairs arranged in judgment, their faces grave with aristocratic concern that barely masked opportunistic calculation. "Lord Pemberton has secured audiences with half the peerage," Ashford said, voice clipped with urgency. "He suggests, delicately of course, that perhaps your fitness to steward Westshire should be reconsidered. A duke without heirs is a duke without future. And a dukedom without future is a crisis requiring intervention." "Pemberton is a gambler and a predator," James said quietly. "Everyone knows what he is. Everyone knows what he is to servants and tenant farmers." Ashford's tone sharpened. "To the peerage, he is charming, well-connected and increasingly persuasive. Your Grace, we must act decisively. Lady Catherine Thornhill has signalled willingness. The match would be advantageous, the timeline accelerated. We could announce an engagement within the month." James looked at the papers spread across his desk. Marriage contracts, lineage charts, the carefully constructed machinery of aristocratic succession. 6 weeks ago he would have signed them. 6 weeks ago he had been a different man, one who believed duty meant erasure, that honour required the sacrifice of everything that mattered. Then he had seen his son building towers from stones in a garden he should have inherited. "No," he said. The room fell silent. Advisers exchanged glances that spoke volumes, concern, confusion, the first stirrings of alarm. "Your Grace," Ashford began carefully, "perhaps you misunderstand the severity." "I understand perfectly." James stood, and something in his bearing made the advisers lean back. "I understand that Pemberton is positioning himself to claim what is not his. I understand that you believe a conventional marriage will solve this crisis. And I understand that I will not comply." "Then what do you propose?" The question came sharp, almost accusatory. James thought of Thomas's laugh, Karen's fierce protection, the 5 years he had lost to cowardice. "I propose to address the crisis honestly." He left them arguing in his study and rode to the cottage alone, arriving as dusk turned the sky to bruised purple. Karen met him at the door, blocking entry, her expression as welcoming as winter stone. "Thomas is sleeping," she said, as if that explained why the Duke of Westshire should turn around and leave. "I came to speak with you." James dismounted, but did not approach. 3 visits had taught him to respect her boundaries, to earn each step forward. "Pemberton is making his move. My advisers want me married within the month to secure a conventional heir." Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, that he would choose the easier path. "Then marry. Secure your precious succession. We've managed 5 years without you. We'll manage the rest." "I don't want to manage without you." The words came raw, unpolished. I need to know my son. Not in stolen afternoons. Not in secret. I need to be his father, Karen, in whatever form you'll allow." "Why?" she demanded. "Because Pemberton threatens your inheritance?" Because you need Thomas now when it's convenient? Because I was a coward once, and it cost me everything worth having. He met her gaze, refusing to look away from her justified anger. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to prove I've changed. Let me know him. Not with money, not with gifts, with presence, with consistency, with the courage I should have had 5 years ago. Karen studied him in the failing light, this man who had destroyed her and given her Thomas, who had been weak when she needed strength, and now offered strength when she had learned to live without it. Charity I will refuse, she said finally. Money I do not want. But if you can show up, week after week, regardless of what it costs you, if you can choose Thomas over your reputation, your advisors, your carefully constructed aristocratic world, then perhaps, I will believe you've become someone worthy of knowing him. James nodded slowly. Then I will prove it. We'll see, Karen said and closed the door between them. But this time it felt less like an ending, and more like a test he was finally ready to take. The Duke came every Thursday. At first, Karen counted the minutes until he would leave. She sat rigid in her chair, watching Thomas and James circle each other like cautious animals, the boy curious, the man desperate not to break something precious through clumsy handling. James brought a wooden horse the first week, hand-carved too, expensive. Thomas played with it for 10 minutes before returning to his stones. The Duke's face had collapsed so completely that Karen almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The second week, James asked if Thomas would like to learn to ride. The boy's eyes went wide as moons. Karen wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her son's feet planted firmly on the ground where Dukes couldn't reach him. But Thomas looked at her with such raw longing that she heard herself say yes. She watched James lift Thomas onto the gentlest mare from the estate stables, watched him adjust the boy's posture with hands that trembled slightly, watched him walk beside the horse with the concentrated care of a man holding something he knew he could lose. Thomas laughed, delighted, fearless. And James looked up at her with an expression she couldn't name. Grief and wonder twisted together into something that hurt to witness. By the 5th week, James no longer asked permission to sit by the fire. He simply came, brought books with gilt edges and illustrations Thomas traced with reverent fingers, read aloud in that aristocratic voice until the boy fell asleep against his shoulder. Karen watched from the kitchen, mending clothes with hands that had forgotten how to stay busy, and felt the armor around her heart develop cracks she couldn't seal. She saw him fail more than once, saw him speak to Thomas as he would to an adult, using words too large, concepts too abstract. Saw the boy's confusion, the Duke's immediate frustration with himself, but James always caught himself, always apologized, always tried again with simpler words and gentler tones. He was learning, slowly, badly, but learning. Thomas began calling him Mr. Miller, began running to the window on Thursdays, pressing his face to the glass, waiting, began asking questions about horses and books and the great house on the hill that Mr. Miller came from. The admiration in her son's voice terrified her more than anything. The village noticed. Of course they noticed. Farmers touched their caps with newfound nervousness when Karen walked to market. The baker's wife whispered behind her hand. The butcher asked, too carefully, if His Grace was well. Karen felt the weight of scrutiny return, the old shame trying to resettle on her shoulders like a familiar coat. Then the whispers reached the estate. James arrived one Thursday with his jaw set like granite, fury barely leashed beneath aristocratic control. His advisors had issued an ultimatum, he told her. End the association. Marry appropriately. Stop this unseemly attachment to a former servant and her bastard child. or face complete social exile. Invitations revoked, political alliances severed, the Duke of Westshire reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms. Karen waited for him to comply, waited for him to choose his reputation, his standing, his world, the way he had chosen it 5 years before. Instead, James looked at Thomas playing with his wooden horse by the fire, looked at Karen standing defensive and brittle in her own kitchen, and said quietly, "I told them no." The words hung in the air like a confession. "I told them," he continued, voice steady, despite the earthquake it represented, "that they could withdraw their counsel if they found my choices so objectionable, that I would not be dictated to regarding my own son, that if society wished to exile me, then society could go to hell." Karen stared at him, at this man who had once sacrificed everything to preserve appearances, at this duke who had just chosen a cottage over a kingdom. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. James met her eyes. "Because I have been a coward once. I will not be one twice." Outside, autumn rain began to fall. Inside, something fragile and dangerous took root between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, people could change. The whispers began in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, spreading like poison through London's finest circles before seeping down to the village itself. Lord Pemberton had always been a man who understood the currency of reputation, and he spent his liberally now. A shopkeeper's daughter with a bastard son, he told anyone who would listen, attempting to ensnare the Duke of Ashford with fabricated claims of legitimacy. A scheming woman of low birth, raising a child in squalor and now desperate enough to cast her net toward nobility itself. Karen first noticed the change in how Mrs. Henshaw turned away at the market, her lips pressed thin. Then came the deliberate crossing of the street when she approached, the conversations that died the moment she entered the baker's shop. But words, she had learned long ago, were merely the herald of crueler actions. She returned home one afternoon to find her cottage windows shattered, her small garden trampled into mud. Painted across her door in harsh black letters, "Whore, liar." The bread she'd left cooling on the sill had been ground into the dirt, and Thomas's wooden horse, the one James had carved for him, lay broken in pieces on the doorstep. Her hands shook as she cleaned the paint, each scrub of the brush an act of furious defiance, even as tears blurred her vision. She had survived worse than this. She had survived everything alone. But Thomas, she could not protect from this particular cruelty. He came home from the village with his shirt torn and his lip bleeding, trying so hard to be brave even as his small body trembled. The other boys had surrounded him, he said, their voices ugly with words they'd learned from their parents. Bastard, pretender, liar's son. They'd asked him who his father was, laughing when he couldn't answer, mocking him when he tried to defend her honor with his child's fists. "Mama," he whispered that night, his voice breaking on the word. "Why do they say those things? Why do they say I'm not that? Papa isn't." And Karen, who had borne everything with her head high, who had never once complained or begged, felt something inside her shatter beyond repair. When James arrived at her door the next morning, she didn't let him pass the threshold. The declaration he'd drafted sat in her hands, but she didn't look at it. She looked at him instead, this duke, who had given her a son and a ghost of a life, who visited in shadows and left before dawn, who offered her everything except the one thing that mattered. "Leave," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "And don't come back. Karen, your half-measures and your cowardice are destroying us. You want to claim him in private while the world tears him apart in public. No more. We're done with your scraps. She closed the door on his protest, on his title, on the whole impossible dream of him. James returned to Westshire alone, the estate colder than he remembered despite the summer heat. His advisers waited in the study, leather portfolios arranged on the mahogany desk like surgical instruments. They spoke in the careful tones men use when delivering necessary cruelties. The marriage contract had been prepared, the heiress's family eager, the settlement generous enough to restore what scandal had taken. All he needed to do was sign. He held the pen above the paper and saw Thomas's face instead, the boy who had his mother's quiet strength and his own stubborn chin, who was learning to be ashamed of existing. James set down the pen. His hands were shaking. That night, he walked through rooms that had housed 4 generations of Ashford men, each portrait staring down with the same expression of entitled certainty. They had all made the practical choice, the one that preserved name and fortune. They had married well, produced legitimate heirs, kept their indiscretions discreet. They had died respected. They had also died alone, he realized, surrounded by silver and silence. He thought of Karen in that shabby street, working herself hollow to feed their son. He thought of how her eyes had looked when she told him to leave. Not angry, just finished. Tired of being erased. He had spent months trying to save his reputation, and in doing so had become someone whose reputation wasn't worth saving. The next morning, James summoned his solicitor. Not to sign the marriage contract, but to draft something else entirely, a formal acknowledgement of Thomas Edward Ashford as his legitimate son and heir. His advisers erupted in protest. The scandal would be irreversible, society would shun him, his mother would likely disown him, every door in London would close. "Then I'll live with closed doors," James said quietly. The words felt like removing a stone from his chest. "I've spent too long protecting a name my son cannot claim. What good is respectability if I cannot look at myself in a mirror?" He signed the document with a hand that no longer trembled. He added his personal seal, making it irrevocable. Then he instructed his solicitor to arrange a monthly allowance for Karen, generous enough that she would never again have to choose between pride and survival, and to purchase a small estate in Surrey under Thomas's name, held in trust until he came of age. His advisers left in disgust. His mother sent a letter he did not open. By evening, word had spread through London's drawing rooms like floodwater. James Ashford, Duke of Westshire, had chosen his illegitimate son over everything his family had built. He had chosen love over legacy, truth over comfort. He had finally chosen right. The chandeliers of Westshire Hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns and polished medals as the autumn ball reached its crescendo. James stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching the swirl of colour and privilege, feeling the weight of what he was about to do settle into his bones like winter frost. Eleanor's hand found his elbow. "You're certain?" He turned to her, this woman who had loved him despite everything, who had chosen to stand beside him even as society's doors began to close. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The orchestra swept into a waltz. James crossed the floor with measured steps, each one carrying him further from the man he had been. When he reached the conductor's podium, he raised his hand. The music stuttered, then died. The dancers froze mid-step, confusion rippling through the crowd like wind across wheat. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried to every corner of the vast room, "I beg your indulgence for a moment. There is a matter that must be addressed tonight before all of you, and I will not postpone it another hour." The murmurs began immediately. He saw Lord Pemberton near the refreshment tables, his face already darkening with rage. Good. Let him hear every word. 22 years ago, I wronged a woman. Sarah Miller was her name, and she was good and kind, and I was young and thoughtless and cruel. The whispers rose to a roar, but James pressed on. She bore my son in disgrace and poverty, while I wore my honor like a badge I hadn't earned. That son is Thomas Miller, and he is here tonight as my guest, my acknowledged son, and my heir. A woman near the front gasped. Someone dropped a glass. The sound of crystal shattering seemed impossibly loud. If any man here disputes my claim or questions my son's legitimacy, he may address me directly. James scanned the crowd, meeting scandalized gazes without flinching. I will not hide behind lawyers or intermediaries. Thomas Miller is blood of my blood, and I name him such before God and all of you. The exodus began almost immediately. Lady Ashworth gathered her daughters and swept toward the doors, her face rigid with disapproval. The Honourable Mr. Fitzroy followed, then the Cavendishes, then a dozen others. Their departure was a tide James had expected, had prepared himself for, but others remained. Young Lord Hartley stepped forward first, inclining his head in acknowledgment, then Sir Geoffrey, then, surprisingly, even Lord Blackwood. Not approval, perhaps, but something like respect for a man who would fall on his own sword for his principles. James found Thomas in the crowd, saw the tears streaming down his son's face, and knew that whatever came next, scandal, isolation, ruin, he had finally done the one thing that mattered. He had chosen love over legacy, truth over reputation, and in that choice, he had found his redemption. The silence was immediate and absolute. Within a week, invitations that had once arrived by the dozen simply stopped. The Duke's name disappeared from guest lists like a ghost at dawn. At White's, conversations faltered when he entered. At Parliament, colleagues found urgent business elsewhere. Lady Pemberton cut him directly at the opera, turning her back with such theatrical precision that the entire box noticed. Even Hartley, his oldest friend, sent a terse note declining to stand with him at the autumn shoot. James had expected resistance. He had not expected erasure. The butler reported fewer callers each morning, his voice growing quieter with each recitation of empty hours. The household staff walked on eggshells, uncertain whether their master had committed social suicide or performed some act of delayed honor they couldn't quite pass. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the verdict was clear. The Duke of Westshire had lost his mind over some base-born child, and a nobody governess, throwing away centuries of dignity for sentiment. But then came the letter from Lord Ashford, the reform-minded Earl, who had shocked society by marrying an industrialist's daughter. "Your courage speaks louder than their silence," he wrote. "Dine with us Thursday." At that dinner, James met others. A viscount who had acknowledged his illegitimate daughter, a baronet funding schools in Manchester, even a bishop quietly sympathetic to revision of bastardy laws. They were few, scattered, often dismissed by their peers, but they existed. A different kind of aristocracy, building itself in the margins. The commoners were less circumspect. Letters arrived from clerks, shopkeepers, even a factory foreman in Leeds who had read the announcement in the papers. They praised his honesty, his willingness to shoulder consequences. A political cartoonist depicted him standing alone against a wall of sneering nobles, caption reading, "One man's honor." James kept that one, despite its crude lines and his resemblance to a tragic hero. It reminded him that reputation had layers, and he had chosen which one mattered. Karen's letter arrived 3 weeks after the announcement. Brief, careful, stripped of sentiment. "I will come to Westshire. We must discuss Thomas's future." She arrived on a grey afternoon, stepping from the carriage with Thomas's hand in hers, and James saw her take in everything. The grand entrance, yes, but also the emptiness of the drive, the lack of other guests, the cost written in his face. In the library, while Thomas explored the shelves with wide eyes, they negotiated like diplomats after a war. "He is the heir," James said, "but you are his mother. That doesn't change." Karen's shoulders dropped slightly, tension releasing. "Primary custody remains with me. You may have him summers, holidays, gradually." "Agreed. And Karen," he paused, measuring words, "I am not asking forgiveness, only the chance to prove I've learned the difference between claiming and earning." She studied him, this man who had destroyed his reputation for their son. Finally, she nodded. "Then we begin there." The morning of their wedding, James found Karen standing at the cottage window, watching Thomas chase butterflies through the wildflowers. She wore a simple cream dress, no veil, no pretense. When she turned to him, her smile carried all the quiet certainty he'd once lacked. "Are you certain?" she asked, though her eyes already knew the answer. "I've never been more certain of anything," he said, taking her hands. "Except perhaps that our son has your stubborn spirit." They married in the village church with fewer than 20 witnesses, mostly servants who had become friends, a few neighbors who had watched their scandal transform into something resembling grace. The vicar stumbled only once over the words, unused to performing ceremonies where the social gulf was so vast yet somehow bridged. Thomas stood beside them, serious in his small suit, clutching the rings as though they were treasure. There was no grand ball, no cascade of congratulations from the peerage. Lord Ashford sent a terse note of acknowledgement. Lady Pemberton wrote nothing at all. But Mrs. Hodges wept openly, and the stable-master proposed a toast that made even James laugh. Life settled into patterns that still surprised him. 3 days each week at Ashford Manor, managing estates and attending to duties he could not entirely abandon. 4 days at the cottage, where Thomas learned his letters and Karen tended her garden, and James discovered he preferred mending fences to attending parliamentary sessions. The estate managers adjusted. The tenants whispered less. Society's memory, he learned, was both longer and shorter than expected. They would never forget, but they would eventually move on to fresher scandals. Thomas flourished in the space between worlds. He took lessons in the manor's library with tutors who no longer questioned his legitimacy, then spent afternoons in the village where he was simply Tom, beloved by the blacksmith's children and the baker's wife. He had his mother's kindness and his father's determination, and watching him grow, James understood what he'd been protecting all along. The second child came on a rain-swept April evening. James held his daughter for the first time as dawn broke through storm clouds, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with absolute trust. They named her Grace, for the unearned mercy that had rebuilt their lives. "She looks like you," Karen whispered, exhausted and radiant. "She looks like hope," James replied. Standing later in the cottage doorway, watching his wife rock their daughter while Thomas slept upstairs, James thought of his father's portrait in the manor's gallery, that stern face guarding accumulated centuries of Ashford pride. He'd spent his life trying to honor that legacy, never understanding that inheritance wasn't about preserving what came before. It was about having the courage to build something better. His family slept peacefully. Outside, the storm had cleared, and James Ashford, duke and father, husband and man, finally felt like he'd come home.